Something broke in Europe this week, not gradually, not through the slow erosion of trust that political analysts write about in academic papers. It broke the way a dam breaks. One moment the structure is holding, the next moment it is not, and everything behind it is moving. What happened between Rome and Budapest in the last 72 hours was not a diplomatic disagreement. It was not a policy dispute dressed up in nationalist language. It was two of the most consequential governments in Europe looking at the institution that claims authority over their economies, their borders, their energy bills, and their futures, and saying the same word at the same time. No, not privately, not through back channels, not in the carefully managed language of European institutional dissent, where you signal opposition while maintaining the appearance of cooperation, publicly, deliberately, on the record, with the full weight of two sovereign governments behind every syllable. Ursula von der Leyen has survived Donald Trump's economic assault. She survived a pandemic. She survived the Pfizer scandal, the Green Deal backlash, the farmers' revolt, and 5 years of opposition from every direction. But she has never faced this, because this is not opposition. This is dismantlement. And it has already started. To understand what Italy and Hungary just did, you have to understand what nobody inside the Brussels bubble is willing to say clearly. The European Union does not run on treaties. It does not run on shared values or democratic consensus or the collective will of 450 million people. It runs on fear. Specifically, it runs on the fear of consequences. The fear that if you push back too hard, the funds get frozen. The fear that if you say the wrong thing publicly, the condemnation procedures begin. The fear that if your government drifts too far from the Brussels consensus, the diplomatic isolation starts and the financial pressure follows until you either comply or collapse. That fear is the load-bearing wall of the entire EU enforcement architecture. And what Giorgia Meloni and Viktor Orban just did in Rome was not simply challenge a policy position or criticize a commission directive. They walked directly up to that load-bearing wall, looked at it from every angle, tested it with their full political weight, and discovered what some of them had long suspected. It is hollow. The wall that Brussels has used to discipline, silence, and control elected governments across the continent for decades is hollow. And the moment that becomes visible to the other governments watching from the sidelines, the entire structure of EU institutional authority begins to collapse in ways that no emergency summit, no strongly worded statement, and no reappointment of Ursula von der Leyen to another term can reverse. The Rome meeting between Meloni and Orban was not spontaneous, and it was not symbolic. Every detail was chosen with the precision of people who understand that in European politics, theater is substance. The location was Palazzo Chigi, the seat of Italian executive power, one of the most symbolically loaded addresses in the political history of the continent. When Orban walked through those doors and Meloni received him not as a controversial figure to be managed at arm's length, but as a full partner in a shared political project, the message required no translation. Budapest and Rome were no longer operating inside Brussels' framework. They were building something outside it. And they were doing it in public, on purpose, daring the Commission to respond in a way that would prove every accusation they were making. Von der Leyen's response confirmed the accusation before it was even formally made. Her office issued statements. Officials expressed concern. The Commission machinery produced its standard language about unity and shared values and constructive dialogue, and every single word of it landed with the political force of a paper airplane. Because the problem Brussels is now facing is not that Meloni and Orban said something provocative. The problem is that what they said is verifiably, documentably, undeniably true. And an institution that has spent years using the language of democracy to protect itself from democratic accountability has no clean answer to the truth. Von der Leyen was not elected by European citizens. No name on any ballot. No population that chose her to govern their energy policy, their migration framework, their budget constraints, or their foreign policy orientation. She was selected in a closed room by heads of state operating their own political agendas and confirmed by a European Parliament that most Europeans cannot name 3 members of. From that position of zero democratic mandate, She has spent 5 years issuing directives that carry the force of law across 27 nations, freezing funds owed to member states whose elected governments hold policy positions she disapproves of, and lecturing prime ministers chosen by millions of voters about what European values require them to do with their own countries. That is not governance. That is occupation dressed in institutional language. And Meloni, who was elected by millions of Italian citizens in a democratic contest that nobody disputes, has now said so plainly enough that the argument cannot be managed or reframed or buried in a committee report. Italy is not Hungary. That sentence alone explains why what happened in Rome represents a category shift in European politics. Hungary has been challenging Brussels for years. Orban has absorbed frozen funds, condemnation procedures, legal challenges, and diplomatic isolation with a consistency that Brussels found both infuriating and ultimately manageable. Because Hungary could be framed as an outlier, a difficult case, a small economy with an eccentric leader whose resistance, while irritating, did not threaten the structural integrity of the European project. That framing required Italy to stay in line. Italy is a founding member of the European Union. Italy is the third largest economy in the Eurozone. Italy is not a peripheral irritant. Italy is the foundation. And when the foundation publicly validates the structural critique that Brussels spent years dismissing as fringe nationalism, you cannot fix the problem by labeling the foundation problematic. The other governments watching from Warsaw, Vienna, Prague, and Bratislava understood this immediately. They did not need a political analyst to explain the significance. They did the calculation themselves in real time. If Meloni can stand next to Orban in the heart of Rome, validate his positions on migration, energy policy, and financial sovereignty, challenge von der Leyen's democratic legitimacy by implication, and face no consequence severe enough to reverse her position, then the political cost of resistance just dropped for every government in Europe that has been quietly chafing under Brussels' authority while publicly maintaining the appearance of cooperation. The question is no longer whether resistance to Brussels is possible. Rome proved it is possible. The question is now whether the rewards of resistance outweigh the remaining risks. And for the first time in the history of the European Union, Brussels does not have a convincing answer to that question. What Meloni and Orban built in Rome goes beyond a political alignment. It is the skeleton of an alternative European power structure, one that does not require Commission permission to function, one that can absorb Brussels' financial threats because the member states involved have economies large enough and political bases solid enough to sustain the pressure without buckling. One that grows stronger each time Brussels responds with the same enforcement tools it has always used. Because every frozen fund, every condemnation procedure, every statement from an unelected commissioner telling elected governments how to run their countries becomes recruitment material for the nations watching from the sidelines and calculating whether the time has come to stop watching and start moving. The energy dimension of what came out of Rome is where the argument becomes most devastating and most impossible for Brussels to answer cleanly. The EU's green transition agenda represents the single largest expansion of Commission regulatory reach in the institution's history. Under the banner of climate targets and carbon neutrality deadlines, Brussels inserted itself into national energy markets, industrial policy, automotive manufacturing, agricultural practices, and household consumption patterns in ways that would have been politically unthinkable 20 years ago. And it did all of this while systematically insulating itself from democratic accountability by framing every objection as climate denial and every request for flexibility as ideological betrayal of European values. What Meloni and Orban said in Rome was not that climate change is a fiction. What they said is that using climate policy as a permanent vehicle for expanding unaccountable central authority over the economic lives of European citizens is something their governments will no longer accept. And that argument is landing with force across Central and Eastern Europe precisely because the damage it describes is real and visible and sitting in the lived experience of millions of ordinary people. The energy costs are real. The industrial damage is real. The households struggling to pay bills that doubled while Brussels published green transition success reports is real. You cannot counter that argument with another press release about European climate leadership. You can only counter it with accountability. And accountability is the one thing the Commission under von der Leyen has never offered. The financial sovereignty argument that emerged from Rome may ultimately prove to be the most structurally significant element of everything that happened there. Because when Meloni stood next to Orban and implicitly validated his position on the funds Brussels has been withholding from Hungary, she did not simply express solidarity with a political ally. She introduced a question into European institutional discourse that the Commission has no legitimate answer to. If the EU can freeze funds owed to a member state, not because that state violated its membership treaty, but because its elected government holds policy positions the Commission disapproves of, then what exactly is EU membership? It is not a partnership of sovereign nations operating under agreed rules. It is a subscription service with a penalty clause that activates whenever the subscriber disagrees too loudly with the provider. And Italy, as a founding member and net contributor to the EU budget, recognized that dynamic from the inside with the clarity of someone who has been watching the mechanism operate for decades and understands exactly what it is designed to do. That principle, if it spreads from Rome outward across the governments now watching and calculating, does not just protect Hungary from financial coercion. It dismantles the Commission's single most effective enforcement tool. And without that tool, the entire architecture of Brussels' discipline over its member states becomes something that can be challenged, refused, and ultimately ignored by any government with sufficient size and sufficient political will. Brussels knows this. Von der Leyen knows this. And the fact that her response to Rome was institutional language rather than genuine engagement tells you everything you need to know about whether she has a strategy to stop what is coming. She does not have a strategy. She has a press office. And a press office is not enough for what Italy and Hungary just set in motion, because what was built in Rome in those 3 hours behind closed doors is not finished. It is just beginning. And the next phase of what Meloni and Orban are preparing targets something so central to von der Leyen's hold on power that when it lands, there will be no institutional language capable of absorbing the impact. What is that target? And which other European government just quietly signaled that it is ready to join them when the moment comes? The government that just quietly signaled alignment with Rome is not one that Brussels ever expected to lose. This is not a Central European nation with a history of institutional friction. This is not a country that has been building toward resistance for years in ways that the Commission could monitor, anticipate, and prepare countermeasures against. This is a government that the European establishment has always counted as structurally secure. A government whose public positioning has been consistently, reliably, visibly pro-European in all the ways that matter to Brussels. A government whose defection from the consensus does not just add another vote to the resistance bloc, it changes the mathematical and political reality of what Brussels can and cannot do next. The signal came not through a dramatic public statement, but through the mechanism that European governments use when they want to communicate a position without formally committing to it. A series of bilateral conversations, a pattern of abstentions on Commission proposals where full support had previously been automatic. A carefully worded interview by a senior minister that stopped just short of explicit endorsement of the Rome position, but communicated the same underlying conclusion to anyone fluent in the language of European institutional politics. In Brussels, that kind of signal is not ambiguous. It is a declaration delivered in the dialect of plausible deniability. And the Commission's internal intelligence operation, which monitors member state positioning with the focused attention of an institution that understands its own vulnerability, flagged it immediately. The problem for von der Leyen is that flagging it and having the tools to respond to it are two entirely different things, because the response toolkit that Brussels has relied on for decades was built for a specific kind of challenge. It was built to handle isolated governments that could be financially pressured, diplomatically marginalized, and politically framed as threats to European unity in ways that made their own populations uncomfortable with the cost of continued resistance. That toolkit has three fundamental requirements to function. The government being targeted must be small enough to isolate. The resistance must be singular enough to frame as exceptional. And the broader membership must remain sufficiently unified that the targeted government sees no viable alternative to eventual compliance. Rome destroyed all three requirements simultaneously. Italy is too large to isolate. The resistance is no longer singular. And the broader membership is no longer unified in ways that make compliance feel like the only viable path. The toolkit is broken. And von der Leyen, who built her entire second term on the assumption that the toolkit would remain functional, is now standing in front of a crisis she has no instruments to resolve. The 2024 European Parliament elections are the key to understanding why this moment was always coming and why Brussels chose to ignore every warning sign that it was. When the National Conservative and hard right blocs surged across the continent in numbers that had no precedent in the Parliament's history, the Brussels establishment faced a choice. It could read that result as a genuine democratic signal from European citizens that the direction of the institution needed to change. Or it could treat it as a temporary disruption to be managed through coalition arithmetic that kept the surging parties away from meaningful institutional power, regardless of how many votes they received. Brussels chose the second path without hesitation. A grand coalition was assembled specifically to wall off the National Conservative bloc from committee chairs, institutional positions, and the levers of real legislative influence. Von der Leyen was reappointed to a second term, despite the fact that her political family had just absorbed a historic electoral rebuke at the ballot box. The parties that lost were rewarded with positions. The parties that won were frozen out, and the institution went back to issuing directives as if the election had never happened. That decision was not just politically arrogant, it was strategically catastrophic. Because what Brussels communicated to Meloni, to Orban, and to every other leader whose political movement had just won historic support from European citizens was precise and unambiguous. Your voters do not matter. Your victories do not count. The system will reorganize itself to neutralize your success, regardless of how many people choose you. And if the democratic path to changing this institution is blocked by the institution itself, then the only remaining path runs outside it. Meloni understood this before Rome. The Rome meeting was where she formalized it, and what she and Orban built in that room is precisely the outside path that Brussels left them no choice but to construct. The international dimension of what came out of Rome is where this story becomes truly global and where the mainstream European press has most catastrophically failed to cover what is actually happening. The Trump administration's return to power did not simply change American foreign policy positions on trade and defense. It changed the structural environment in which European institutional authority operates. Under the previous Washington consensus, European leaders who challenged the EU's liberal institutional order faced a double pressure. Brussels applied financial and diplomatic pressure from inside the system, and American institutional machinery operating in alignment with the Brussels establishment applied additional pressure from outside it. Leaders who resisted were not just fighting the Commission. They were fighting the entire transatlantic institutional complex that had been constructed over decades to reinforce a specific vision of what European governance should look like and who should be doing it. That double pressure is gone. The Trump administration does not view Orban as a democratic backslider to be pressured into compliance. It views him as a demonstration that national conservative governance can win elections, maintain stability, and deliver results that populations actually want. It does not view Meloni as a threat to Western values. It views her as evidence that the nationalist wave that reshaped American politics in 2016 and again in 2024 has genuine European roots and genuine European staying power. When Washington's posture toward Brussels shifted from protective alignment to open skepticism, it did not just change American policy. It removed the external wall that Brussels had been leaning on whenever its own enforcement mechanisms came under pressure from the inside. And Meloni, who has cultivated her relationship with the Trump orbit with the careful precision of someone who understands exactly what that relationship is worth strategically, understood immediately what the removal of that wall meant for the internal EU power balance. It meant that the room in Rome had more space to work with than any similar room in European political history. The economic argument that Meloni and Orban are now making,